we meet in an hour of change and challenge, in a decade of hope and fear, in an age of both knowledge and ignorance. If this capsule history of our progress teaches us anything, it is that man in his quest for knowledge and progress is determined and cannot be deterred. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the next episode of the Energy Impact Podcast. I'm your host, Michael Crabb, and I'm really excited to be joined today by Andy Herscowitz, the Chief Development Officer at the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation. Andy, great to have you on.
Great, thanks for having me.
Well, I can't wait to get into all the exciting work that you're doing, but perhaps first tell us a little bit about yourself. Where did you grow up? How did you end up kind of on the path that you are today?
Great. So I grew up just outside of Washington, D.C. in Maryland, and spent, basically did everything all up through high school there. And then I stayed local in Washington, D.C., and I went to Georgetown for undergraduate. And then between undergraduate and law school, which was also at Georgetown, I spent a year in Nicaragua doing development work on a volunteer program that Georgetown had. I also in high school was an exchange student in the Dominican Republic. So I got this itch for working in developing countries and for pursuing development as a career very, very early. I would tell people that the first words in Spanish that I learned were no hay agua ni hay luz. There's no water and there's no power. And the power in the water would go out suddenly. And it's not an exaggeration. Those are literally the first words I learned when I was an exchange student in the Dominican Republic. And so I knew that I really wanted to go into development. But after law school, I went and worked at a law firm. Worked at two different law firms for a few years, but every time a headhunter or others would try to, recruit me for something, I'd say, I want to go overseas. If you have anything overseas, I don't really care what it pays, let me know. And then I was talking to a colleague in the office next to mine, and he had told me about how he had grown up overseas, where his father was a lawyer for the U.S. Agency for International Development. And we're talking about it several times, so I started looking into that and applied several times over a few years. And I finally was lucky enough to get selected to be what was then a regional legal advisor for USAID. And that started my career in government. Now, 20 years later, I'm at the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, where I'm its first chief development officer.
Yeah, so enough on your resume to fill maybe 4 or 5 episodes, but I am curious, kind of coming back to your trip to, first trips to Nicaragua, and what sort of caused that interest? I mean, your buddies were probably skateboarding or playing football, and you're like, I want to go travel and help develop countries. Like, how does that come about?
I think it was the time when I was only 16 years old when I was in Dominican Republic, in a developing country, and just realizing that there was this whole world out there. Plus, I grew up in Washington, D.C., went to college there. It's like, I need to get out. And here I am, I'm back here again.
Yeah.
But it really was seeing how interesting, how different the cultures were, looking at what the infrastructure needs were, and then reflecting back on the U.S. And I remember when we were our group of Georgetown students in Nicaragua, we'd talk about, what Nicaragua, this is the early 90s, what Nicaragua needed to get on a path towards development. And it was the poorest country in the hemisphere after Haiti. And I'd always reflect on the US and why the US really took off. And I've got a whole bunch of views on what made the US develop in the way that it did. But one of them was a heavy focus on infrastructure. And we saw like when the roads were built, the cross-country highways were built, the businesses that pop up along, when the railroads were built, the businesses, the cities that pop up. And you see that by building out the infrastructure, it creates the economic growth that lifts people out of poverty. And I used to say, and I guess I'm dating myself, that in the US, you go anywhere in America and there would be a Blockbuster video and a McDonald's. Now, there aren't Blockbuster videos anymore. But the point is that anywhere in America you would go and you had this infrastructure, and then jobs get created around that. So then when I was living in Nicaragua, we talk about that, and I saw firsthand I was pretty cynical about the work of USAID at the time. Had long hair and a ponytail, and USAID came to town one day. They all pulled up in their fancy cars, you know, in their khaki pants and their Oxford shirts. I'm now that guy, right? And I'm like, there's USAID doing really great work. Well, what I realized shortly thereafter was USAID was doing really great work, because one of the programs they did, it was like a jobs for works program. And the town that I lived in, there were only dirt roads in the town. But over a period of about 3 or 4 weeks, they came in and they brought like interlocking blocks, like pavers basically. And they employed pretty much every able-bodied person in that town for about a month, where people got extra money. And then what was left behind were these very nice paved roads for the town, which is maybe a few thousand people. And then what people did with that extra money was, one guy, it was a fishing village. One guy bought a cooler so that he could preserve his fish longer and let him cut out a middleman, so he made more money. Another person bought a refrigerator that he was using to sell Coke. And I saw just firsthand how just those types of economic stimulation projects could transform a small village, and it was really impactful. So I really resolved myself to saying, like, this is something that I want to do, to see what we could do to try to improve the lives of others.
Yeah, well, really fantastic. So you go back to law school, you practicing in a firm for a little bit. There's a lot of other podcasts that people can learn about that. So we'll fast forward through those years. And then I think you ended up in Peru first. Is that right? So,
no, so I was lucky. I went back to the Dominican Republic.
Okay.
Now,
so
I've
tell us about that
there.
transition. Yeah.
Yeah. So I went back to Dominican Republic. I spent 5 years there as the regional legal advisor, covering the whole Caribbean. And so I spent a lot of time in Haiti. It shares the island with Haiti. And so when I first joined USAID, I was the lawyer for what was called the Development Credit Authority Office. It was the loan guarantee program. It was a brand new program. And so the idea was that USAID for years had been using mostly grants and contracts, where you go into a country, say, this is a problem we want to solve. Let's either give a grant or hire a contractor to work on solving that problem. And what the Development Credit Authority did was it got people to think a little bit differently, and got them thinking, how can we use the private sector and with their profit motive to solve the development problem? So you want to create jobs? How can we go to a local bank and give it a guarantee so it can do lending to a whole bunch of small businesses? So that was the idea, was using our money to help encourage loan guarantees. So when I was in Dominican Republic, I helped work on some of the very first loan guarantee programs, even in Haiti. And I got a lot of pushback from people back in Washington at the time, because their view was, well, look, there was just a coup in the country a few months ago. Haiti has a lot of coups d'etats. And my response to them is, the one constant that you've seen in Haiti over the last 50 years has been the banking sector. So if anybody understands the risk of doing business in Haiti, it's these banks, which have survived. So we went forward and we moved forward on those projects, and there really weren't any significant defaults that I'm aware of. So it was very successful. So it's really, what I came up with is that people assume there's a certain amount of risk in places, but to really make a difference from a development standpoint, you have to be willing to dig in and really understand where the real risks are.
And so how do you go about evaluating that, right? I mean, the gap between perception and reality in some of these countries, I imagine, is quite large. How do you go about sort of convincing people back in Washington that, you know, yeah, that these institutions will survive? The history is a good indication of future performance. When it's, you know, you just can't, how do you know, right?
So you have to do, you do due diligence, but you also rely heavily on people in the field, you know, but you have to keep in the back of your mind something really important that people forget about, right? The US government will pay a contractor or give a grant to do something for us to achieve a goal. Now, if you have a choice between taking, you know, $10 million and building a solar array and just building it, you're never going to get that money back, because you're just paying someone to build it and you're going to leave it behind. If you have the option of saying, you know what, let's get somebody else to build it, and they're going to be the ones who sell the power, and we're going to lend them $10 million, you might lose the money, but most of the time you won't lose the money. And if you do 10 projects, you know, for $100 million, and you lose out on one of them. So the U.S. taxpayers spent 10 million instead of 100 million. Whereas if you just build 10 of those projects, the U.S. taxpayers spent $100 million. So you've got to do due diligence. You can't just like give money the way, lend money without doing due diligence. But you also can't kill yourself into like fearing that you might lose some money. You have to be willing to take the risk, because the whole point of your existence is to try to promote private sector development in really difficult environments, while not displacing private banks and others who would otherwise do the lending. That's the role of the private sector, development finance institutions and development institutions.
Yeah, so really kind of bridging that gap a little bit. It makes a lot of sense. Maybe talk about how you've seen that evolve. This is what, in the mid 2000s or mid to late 2000s, right? And so you've seen energy. At that time, solar projects were probably, were cutting edge, right? I mean, maybe talk about how that's kind of evolved, and then we can kind of lead into your new role.
So then from the Dominican Republic, I moved to Peru, where I ended up becoming the USAID Deputy Mission Director. And then I moved on to Ecuador. And while I was in Ecuador, I got a call about a new initiative that President Obama was looking at launching during his second term that wanted to focus on energy in Africa. And so I was asked to come back and help design and launch this new initiative. And we did it, and we ended up launching it, called Power Africa. And so with Power Africa, I moved to Nairobi, where it was the first ever presidential initiative to be based in the field. And we built it from really nothing over, I did it for 7 years. I eventually moved to South Africa, and I spent 5 years there as well, because there were some issues with the Westgate attacks where it just became difficult for us to operate there. And then, grew it to become the largest public-private partnership for development in history. We got over 170 partners, private companies, bilateral and multilateral institutions of different countries, different banks supported Power Africa. And we helped over 120 power projects reach financial close and helped over 100 million people get access to electricity. But again, it was that idea of using the private sector to advance our development goals. So one of the things that people would criticize me for was saying that I was taking credit for the work that other people were doing. And my response was, that is exactly what I'm doing. It's not me, we should be. And I said, and you should be taking credit for the work that we're doing, because it's not about, trying to show like, look what we did, pat us on the back. We're trying to solve a development issue, and we all need to figure out who can do, what best. And so we had 12 US government agencies working seamlessly well together, where instead of everyone fighting over who should be doing what, we figured out, okay, OPIC at the time, which is now DFC where I work, can do the financing of projects. The U.S. Trade and Development Agency specializes in doing feasibility studies. So they're going to do the feasibility studies. Sometimes, often in the countries, you don't have the proper enabling environment. You don't have the people who have the capacity to understand the newer technologies. So USAID would provide the technical assistance and the training. So we all got together, had a working group, and then we also asked each of our private sector partners and others to make a commitment towards achieving the high level goals that we wanted to achieve, which were 30,000 megawatts, 60 million electrical connections, which is about 300 million people getting access to electricity, and essentially doubling access to electricity in sub-Saharan Africa. So we all were working towards common goals, but working really well together.
Wow. Yeah, those numbers are kind of mind-boggling, right? And there still feels like there's so much work to be done, which is maybe right, which is maybe a good segue to the evolution of that agency and how the USAID kind of became the Development Finance Corporation. Maybe talk a little bit about that, and then we can dive into your role, which, as I understand, is a relatively new position.
Okay, so USAID did not become Development Finance Corporation. I screwed that up. OPIC became Development Finance Corporation. USAID still exists, doing great work. The administrator of USAID is the vice chair of DFC's board. So we work really closely hand in hand with USAID. But really, the place where, like, I'll give you an example of where like the evolution of working with the private sector has evolved, something outside of the power sector. But if you think about the vaccines and what's going on globally, back in 2001, when I first joined USAID, there was a team of lawyers and others who I worked with there who were actively working at creating Gavi, which was meant to be, the global vaccine alliance, right? This was like the first time we were working with like Gates Foundation, private and public, working together to figure out how can we create an organization that brings public and private resources together to solve a major global issue. It was the same time that we helped create the Global Fund for HIV/AIDS, TB, and malaria. We also helped create the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, so the nutrition sort of global organization. And so fast forward 20 years, we're at the height of the COVID pandemic. USAID is actively buying and helping development of vaccines globally and production of vaccines globally, buying hundreds of millions of vaccines to distribute globally. At the same time, we now have DFC, which exists, which provides financing. And so what DFC is able to do is provide risk insurance to Gavi, the same entity that we helped create 20 years ago, which now wants to sell vaccines to the middle-income countries. The middle-income countries can afford the vaccines, but Gavi needs some assurance that they're going to get paid if they agree to sell them to them. And so now DFC is able to provide that insurance, which then allows us to move, billions of vaccines. So you were using both the aid effort, which are purchasing outright vaccines in the poorest countries where they can't afford them at all. And then you have DFC, we're supporting this organization that USAID helped create 20 years ago to provide risk insurance so that they can actually sell vaccines to middle income countries and get paid back. So it's really a fascinating timeline of what we've done over the last 20 years to help create the opportunity for the US government, the US taxpayers to have a major, major impact on people all over the world at a relatively small cost to the US taxpayer.
Yeah, really incredible how it kind of different solutions for different scenarios and customers, right? So can we maybe tie that back to energy?
Sure.
We talked about how many people you touched through Power Africa, and talk a little bit about maybe the energy specific goals that are part of the DFC today, and how you're using those tools that you described to facilitate that. I guess I'll call it a transition, but also increased access.
Yeah. So DFC has established some fairly ambitious climate targets as an agency. We've set the goal of achieving a net zero portfolio by 2040. We've set the goal of having 33% of our portfolio be climate related, starting the fiscal year 23 as well. We want to be sort of at the leading edge of when people talk about new technologies like distributed renewable energy as solving all the issues related to access and productive use. Rather than talk about it, DFC issued a call for applications to see whether or not there are, in fact, commercially viable entities out there that can do this, because it is a challenging sector. And we've got a massive response to that as well. So we're really happy with that because we were nervous about whether we'd be able to do that as well. So DFC really is kind of leading others to say, kind of put our money where our mouth is in terms of trying to see, all right, can we help develop this distributed renewable energy sector so that we can do more than just make sure that people have like a solar lantern, but they actually have productive use, so that they're able to run appliances, they're able to run machinery from the type of energy that they have.
And so what's the scale, when you say distributed, what's the kind of megawatt range that we're talking about here?
Yeah, distributed, it varies widely, and it varies by the country and the need. So we're looking at all types of situations. We're even looking at, a small island we would consider a project on the islands of Lake Victoria, where maybe you need a 10 megawatt solar array, because that's a distributed system. It's not connected to the grid. But a lot of commercial and industrial as well, helping companies figure out how to get more reliable power and greener power, trying to get countries like Nigeria to wean them off the diesel generators that they rely on so heavily that are expensive. The whole idea behind Power Africa really was to figure out how we were looking at the African countries that were growing at the most rapid rate. And at the time, the majority of the fastest growing economies in the world were in Africa. But we realized that the biggest impediment to their growth was energy. You have a garment manufacturer in Kenya that's churning out 40,000 garments a day. They can't afford to have their power go out and then run expensive diesel backup generators, because then their costs go up and then they can't remain competitive with China and other countries. So we realized that we need to not only focus on access to power, but also reliable power. And that's what DFC's been doing. OPIC, now DFC, was the biggest contributor to Power Africa's financing of projects. DFC has done over $2 billion of financing for Power Africa projects. So it was a critical partner amongst the partners that Power Africa had. And I'm really proud of that. DFC also has its first development strategy. So we're not just measuring how much money we invest, but it's important that we measure what the outputs are going to be. You know, I tell people that, yeah, you can brag about spending $10 billion, but what do you achieve with that $10 billion? Is it like a USAID administrator would never go to Congress and brag like, I spent $10 billion this year.
Right.
Response is, well, what did you achieve with that $10 billion? So our roadmap for impact is designed to say, all right, with the $10 billion that we've invested, these are the outputs. This is the number of people who got access to clean water, the number of people who got access to the internet, access to electricity. So that's what we've been doing. So in our roadmap for impact, in the energy sector, we did set a $10 billion goal over by 2025. We also said that we want to make sure that at least 10 million people get access to electricity. And part of our work in doing distributed renewable energy will contribute to that metric.
Yeah, fascinating. How do you think about, I'm going to kind of pull you a little bit further back to the example you gave, kind of the solar power island. How do you think about reliability, which you sort of also discussed with your garment factory example, right? How do you think about distributed generation and newer technologies that may be able to solve some of those reliability challenges that the more proven intermittent resources have struggled with?
Yeah, so there are a lot of really interesting new technologies out there. Some of them that aren't even so new, but they just haven't been commercially deployed. So you think about in the distributed renewable energy space, you've got systems now that are solar, battery, and sometimes it's diesel or gas backup as well. But the idea being that when you do need to run that generator, it can also charge the battery. And hopefully you just significantly reduce the amount of fuel that you need or eliminate it altogether. So we're looking at all those types of technologies. Battery prices are coming down more and more as well. As battery prices come down, it'll allow for a greater amount of storage. So that, I think, like we saw the solar transition happen over the last decade, where you saw prices come down like 500%, about as low as they're going to go. And now I think we're going to see that next phase where the output of batteries or the capacity of batteries will increase while the prices come down as well.
So what about other, talk more about kind of what you expect here over the coming years. What, are you looking at hydrogen? Are you looking at nuclear? Are you looking at direct air carbon capture? What's the scope of your, of what the DFC is looking at?
Yeah, we will look at all technologies, right? We're not opposed to any technologies, but the key is whether it's commercially viable. And a lot of times people say, so we're not investing in new technologies, but what we will invest in is a technology that has proven to be commercially viable in the United States or in Europe, but it hasn't been deployed yet in Africa or in parts of Asia. So like we're not doing venture capital right now. But there are a lot of companies out there that are using technologies that exist. And the question is, how do we help them scale? And whether it's in, directly related to energy power generation, so small modular nuclear or hydrogen, or if it's related to e-mobility. So we support some companies, for example, in Africa that are focused on doing electric motorcycles. And so getting people to use, and then some of them are doing like battery swapping as well, which is really exciting. So we want to be right there to help the companies that are seeking to grow to see what actually is scalable. Often the best technology or the newest technology isn't the one that scales, but the one that scales is the one that can solve the problems. And we want to be there to help companies scale.
And this might be a good time. I think you knew this, but Kate Steele of Nithya, who you recently funded, was a guest on the podcast as well. So kind of fun when we can tie that community together. So I don't know if you feel comfortable giving any color about that particular deal for the listeners, or we can.
So I thought you were going to say Kate Steele's popping in with a special guest star. She's incredible. No, look, we're really excited about the work that they're doing, and just announced an investment in Nithya. So I think people should watch. I mean, one of the keys to making sure that deals are commercially viable is making sure that you have the data that's necessary and to make the right commercial judgments. And Nithya is really at the cutting edge of that sector. So we're excited about what they have to offer moving forward.
Yeah, really, really cool business and opportunity. So coming back, you went out with this call for responses. There's kind of this RFP. You were worried you weren't going to get a lot of responses. It sounds like you maybe had too many. How do you start filtering through and prioritizing and sort of allocating the dollars that you have to commit?
Yeah, I would say there's never too many responses, right? Because what we showed is that there's clearly demand for this, and we got to figure out if the companies are there and they're not getting the financing they need. We need to figure out what the problem is. Is it a problem with the company? Is it a problem with the type of capital that's available? So it's a really great exercise for us to evaluate that. It does. It diverted a lot of resources from a lot of people on our team to a very thoughtful review of each application, and we brought in people from Power Africa as well who weighed in. And then we have a partnership with the Rockefeller Foundation, where Rockefeller agreed to commit $50 million to help us de-risk our investments in distributed renewable energy. We also have a partnership with the Shell Foundation, which agreed to commit some money to help us de-risk investments in this space, in the energy access space as well. So we're working closely with those foundations, with Power Africa, and our really talented team of people at DFC to evaluate them right now.
Yeah, that's really, it's really great to see private, public sector, working so closely together. Maybe talk about any themes or lessons learned after reviewing all of those applications. Is there sort of trends that emerged or other things that you'd be willing to share?
Look, I think it's still too early to tell because we're still reviewing them. We're still screening them. I'll be excited to tell you about it when it happens. But I think the lessons learned is that there is demand for this, and people are trying really hard to get the economics to work on distributed renewable energy. It's challenging, particularly in Africa, where people live far from one another, distances are far, economics can be challenging, the regulatory environments can be challenging. So we as a public sector have to keep on chipping away at it and see if we can get them to the point of commercial viability.
Yeah, are there, and maybe it's just too different country by country, but you talked about your experience in Haiti. Are there lessons that you can apply to Africa and some of the Asian countries that you're focusing on now that, I don't know, is there, I don't know if there's something on the ground.
I think it's the perception of risk that you have to overcome. Getting comfortable with the fact that DFC and other DFIs and IFIs, the World Bank, you have to remind people who work there, you are not a commercial bank. You're not. And you're created with public money for the purpose of doing development, which means that you need to be willing to take on more risk. Now, that being said, it's easy for me to say that because DFC can be distinguished from other institutions because we don't have to earn a return for a shareholder, whereas some of these other public institutions do. DFC gets an appropriation from our Congress, and we just have to make sure that we have appropriate financial performance, which gives us some space to take a little bit more risk. And so we're hoping the whole team is excited about trying to figure out what that will look like, because the entire team at DFC loves our development mandate, and we're really starting to take off in this regard.
Yeah, super exciting time to be in the office. About how many people are on the team? I mean, it seems like a really broad mandate.
At DFC?
Yeah.
DFC, well, we're relatively small compared to the other DFIs and IFIs. I think when I got there were about 300 employees. I think we're over 400 now. During quarantine, we've renovated our office spaces, but now we're realizing there aren't enough offices for all the employees that we've hired since then. So we're trying to figure out how we're going to handle that as well. So we hope to continue to grow commensurate with the size of our portfolio. we have a $60 billion ceiling that Congress gave us. We're only at just over 30 billion right now in terms of what our committed projects are. So we've got a lot of headroom to continue to grow and to have an impact.
I mean, 400 people for $60 billion really doesn't seem like a lot. But yeah, that's got to be really fun. So yeah, looking forward, besides hitting that 60 billion cap, I mean, what do you sort of see in the cards for the next 5 years, next 10 years for the DFC and these programs in particular?
It's the impact. For me, it's the impact. It's when someone jumps on DFC's website and says, what do they even do? You go on the website and it says DFC has helped X million people get access to financing for the first time. It's helped X million smallholder farmers. That DFC has helped bring clean water to people, clean energy to people, internet access to people, so that people see that we're producing results that are directly impacting people, not just dispersing a lot of money. Like, everyone can hold their chest out like, look how much money I've dispersed. Like, I tell people, like, I don't really care how much money you've dispersed. I care about whether or not you're achieving the goal that we set out to achieve, and that's development. Dispersing money does, that does have development, especially like when you bring the first private equity to a low-income country, and then you help create that market. But you need to be able to tell that story of why we did the deal, not just we did a deal.
Yeah, it's that flywheel, right? Once you sort of create one power plant, you create an ecosystem, and then electrical demand grows and roads need to grow.
I'm way more impressed with the very first, 10 megawatt solar project in Guinea than I am with the 10th 100 megawatt solar project in India, for example, because you've done the India project. Doesn't mean that there's not still a need, but the tougher ones are those ones where they've never done that project. For me, success would be countries like Botswana and Namibia really developing their solar potential, because these are countries with very low population density, with some of the highest sun quality in the world, and the ability to interconnect to at least 8 other countries around them or near them. And you could literally provide power to all of Southern Africa, if not the entire African continent, if you could capture those solar resources. And we know how to do it. It's not like a new technology that we need. The technology exists. It's working out the regulatory frameworks and having the agreements and making sure you have a transmission infrastructure. That's what we need to do, because if we can figure that out, there'll be no shortage of deals for us to finance.
So how active of a role, we talked about evaluating risk and the difference between perception and real risk. But what you were just alluding to there is sort of creating or evolving regulatory frameworks. How much rope do you have to say, hey, this has a high impact but long timeline. We want to really go and work to kind of fix this.
And so that's exactly what we have.
Yeah.
I mean, we are the ones who will finance a project for 20 years. So like one of the areas where we're looking to get into, which is a really challenging area from a financial commercial viability standpoint, is nature-based solutions. So like forestry projects. Like, how do you justify giving a $50 million loan for a transaction where it's not going to produce any income for 15 years? Like, they're essentially planting trees, right? And so this is an area where private sector have struggled with, but we think that DFC and other development finance institutions can play a role. So we're going to see how we can make a difference there. The other place is with like local currency lending. A lot of the deals that move forward from the DFIs and even from DFC, we're essentially lending in dollars to people in countries where we know over the 20-year period of that transaction that their currency is going to depreciate against the dollar. So then that it's going to be even more burdensome for them to pay it back 15, 20 years from now. To the extent that we can take the hit or figure out how to mitigate the risk of that local currency so that the ultimate beneficiary isn't struggling 15 years from now or 20 years from now, goes into default, and we're creating an issue, we need to be able to take that hit as well.
Yeah, really interesting. There's got to be lots of levers as you work through even any individual project. I wouldn't have even thought about that on the face. The obviously currency fluctuation has got to be a tough thing to mitigate.
Yeah, I mean, like the more they think about it, if you finance a power project and it's in dollars, And if the dollar depreciates 100% against the local currency 15 years from now, who pays for that? It's going to be the end user, because the tariff for that power is going to have to go up in order to pay off the loan, right? Mm-hmm. So we want to make sure as much as we can that we're not making a country less competitive by the terms of our lending.
Yeah, no, really interesting. And it's funny, ESG comes up a lot on this podcast and obviously in the energy community, but it's clear. I mean, there's no better ESG mandate than nation development, right? I mean, you guys are kind of the first. It's pretty cool to hear about. Well, I know we're running a little bit low on time. I wanted to give you a chance. Anything that we didn't discuss or that you'd like to tell our listeners about, or anything else that you'd like to mention here?
Yeah, no, I'm really excited about the work that DFC is doing. We have an incredible team. We're excited about the Build Back Better World initiative that the Biden-Harris administration has launched in coordination with the G7. That's going to have a heavy focus on infrastructure, particularly benefiting low-income and lower middle-income countries. We want to make sure that countries realize that we're here to be a good partner that's thinking through long-term sustainable development, lending on terms that benefit the country, that build local capacity, make sure that create local jobs, that involve training people on new technologies. So this U.S. model, along with the other G7 partners, really creates a great alternative to what's out there, because we're really thinking through not just what's good for us, but what's good for everyone in the international community to make sure that we've got strong, stable trading partners over a long period of time. So really excited about implementing Build Back Better World.
Awesome. Andy, thanks so much for your time today. Couldn't have imagined a better guest. Looking forward to seeing all the great things that you guys build in the future.
Great. Thanks so much. Take care.
Our leadership in science and industry, our hopes for peace and security, our obligations to ourselves as well as others, all require us to make this effort, to solve these mysteries, to solve them for the good of all men and for the progress of all people.